Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Curtis. And what great leadership Bloomberg is showing in the sustainability movement. It's a pleasure to have all of these great speakers today. It's now checking the time here. Now my pleasure to introduce Gianna McCarthy, who is with the New York State Common Retirement Fund, who will introduce our next special guest speaker. Gianna here? Here she comes. Perfect.
Hi, good afternoon. My pleasure to introduce Commissioner Robert J. Jackson, Jr., who was appointed to the SEC by President Donald J. Trump and was sworn in just last month. He recently gave his first public remarks as commissioner on perpetual dual-class shares, the case against corporate royalty, suggesting exchanges revise listing standards to balance the need for equitable voting schemes against the need to encourage visionary founders to bring their companies public so that mom and pop investors can participate in these companies' tremendous growth potential as well. Commissioner Jackson is on leave from NYU School of Law. He previously was professor of law and director of the program on corporate law and policy at Columbia Law School. While at Columbia, he organized a group of law professors to petition the SEC requesting rulemaking requiring companies to disclose political spending. It received a remarkable 1 million comment letters, including one from my organization, the New York State Common Retirement Fund, in support. He also served as advisor at the Treasury Department and in the Office of the Special Master for TARP Executive Compensation. Commissioner Jackson earned, all in, 5 degrees from Harvard and University of Pennsylvania. Please join me in welcoming Commissioner Jackson.
Thank you so much, Gianna, for that incredibly kind introduction. So good to be back here at home in New York, and what an honor to be speaking after Mayor Bloomberg today. And I'll tell you, as a guy who just moved to D.C. to take a new job, I'm sure the mayor will be pleased to know I plan to be back and speak in New York often, if only so I can get a decent slice of pizza. I was born in the Bronx, just a few subway stops from here, to a big Irish Catholic family. My father was one of 5 kids, and my mother was one of 9, and I've got dozens of cousins spread out around New York. Matter of fact, it'd be great if you could keep the fact that I'm in town just between the 200 of us. Otherwise, I'm going to have to spend the rest of the week visiting everyone. You know, my mom has 3 older brothers, one of whom served for decades as a transit cop, and then he was a detective in the NYPD. My Uncle Jim mostly worked in local precincts, not that far from where he grew up. And today, his son, my cousin Jason, is carrying on that tradition, serving with pride in the NYPD. You know, I thought about them a lot during my first few dizzying weeks at the SEC. And that's because for all the publicity our rulemaking tends to receive, I'll tell you, the daily bread and butter work of the SEC is really enforcing the securities laws. In fact, I spend most of my time with the incredible SEC staff who work all around the world to bring cases against fraudsters we're trying to steal from average investors. They're the real cops on the beat of the financial world, and they play a critical role in ensuring that our markets are the safest and the strongest in the world. And let me tell you, having spent some time with the cops on the beat, both in the NYPD and at the SEC, I've learned a lot about how hard their job is. And if I've learned one thing, it's this: whether on the street or in the securities markets, the cops can't do it alone. No, we need multiple layers of protection to keep our markets safe and strong. And that's especially true in the financial sector, where investors are often the last line of defense, keeping folks from committing fraud. It's a good thing for our country and for everyone in this room, that insiders know that if they try to cheat investors and they get caught, shareholders can sue, and they're going to get their day in court. Now, you're all here to ask today what investors and companies and corporate leaders can do for the long-term good of our markets. And that's why I want to talk to you today about recent rumors that folks are planning on slipping a mandatory arbitration provision of shareholder disputes into an upcoming IPO. The idea here is that our division of corporation finance is going to be required to approve the IPO. And in the stroke of one pen, one company, they'll strip shareholders of their right to their day in court. My pitch to you today is that this is not the way to do this. This will undermine confidence in our markets over the long term. It'll raise questions for every company, everybody in this room, about where you are on corporate fraud. My view on this is whatever the SEC decides to do in this area, we should only do it through a careful public rulemaking process. And I hope today you'll join me in calling on my colleagues at the Commission that if we're going to take away investors' right to their day in court, we should at least do it in the light of day. Now, you all know very well that there are two main ways we enforce securities law in this country. First, the government can identify wrongdoing and bring a case. And second, investors themselves can bring a lawsuit against the responsible individuals and companies. Now, look, government enforcement is crucial to the functioning of our securities markets, and I'm very proud to work alongside the best securities enforcement team in the world. I see the results of their hard work every week in our closed commission enforcement meetings, and I'm heartened by their dedication and their commitment to protecting investors. But at the same time, I gotta tell you, I'm struck again and again by the audacity of fraudsters and the devastating amount of money that our investors lose. And almost daily, I'm reminded that our world-class enforcement lawyers just can't do it all alone. That's why the Supreme Court has said for many years, it's been well understood, that policing corporate wrongdoing is a team effort. The government and investors working together to make sure that the insiders who do the wrong thing are held to account. And nowhere is this more clear in the area of shareholder recovery of losses that fraud causes. Let me give an example. In 2016, 60 cents of every dollar returned to investors in corporate fraud cases came through private rather than SEC settlements. And giving investors their day in court has been even more important when the stakes are the highest, like in the wake of the significant accounting frauds. After scandals at WorldCom, Enron, Tyco, Bank of America, Global Crossing, investors recovered more than $19.4 billion in private lawsuits. And by contrast, we at the SEC obtained $1.75 billion. Now, something else that's important to know is that shareholder suits help us at the SEC do our work. In fact, an important empirical work, a couple of scholars, one of my colleagues, Stephen Choi, has observed that investor lawsuits are as good or better than the government is in targeting securities law violations. Now look, my colleagues at the Division of Enforcement do invaluable work every day protecting investors. But there are limits to what they can do, especially today, when the SEC's budget is frozen and fraudsters are finding new ways to hurt investors every day. Our enforcement efforts are straining at the limits of our budget resources, and recent judicial developments have made the job of our enforcement staff even harder. The Supreme Court's recent ruling in Kokesh v. SEC, for example, prevents the SEC from recovering hundreds of millions of dollars that in the past we could have returned to investors. So it comes as no surprise to me, and it shouldn't to you, that shareholders are working harder than ever before today to help enforce our securities laws. More federal securities lawsuits were filed in 2017 than in any year since 1995. As my colleague Rick Fleming, the SEC's investor advocate, pointed out in a speech over the weekend, because of the limited scope of the SEC's resources, investors themselves bear a large share of the responsibility for policing our securities markets. And that's never been more true than it is today. So now, when the SEC is hamstrung by budgetary and legal limitations, it's hardly the time to think about depriving shareholders their day in court. But there's another reason why I'm skeptical of proposals like these, and I hope you are too. They deprive the public of the confidence they need that corporate wrongdoers are going to be held accountable. You see, the resolution of private disputes in public courts creates what a guy like me would think of as a positive externality. In other words, the public benefits when private litigants show in a public hearing that corporate insiders need to know what the law expects of them. Holding wrongdoers to account tells the public we take corporate fraud seriously, and it sends a signal to insiders, lawyers, and investors that being unfaithful to your shareholders doesn't pay. By contrast, arbitration is usually conducted in a closed-door proceeding, depriving investors of their chance to air their objections, and the rest of us the knowledge of what the law is. And that's especially true when it comes to the fiduciary duties that everyone in this room owes to their investors. One reason is that in this area, we have the benefit of the expertise of the Delaware courts. As a matter of fact, one of the major costs that concerns me most of proposals to bring shareholder lawsuits into the dark is that they would deprive the public of the investor protections the state courts have developed over the years. Those protections would not exist today if those underlying disputes had been privately arbitrated. Now look, of course it's true lawsuits have their own costs. My guess is everyone in this room has found that out the hard way over time. But let's be clear, steps have already been taken to address that problem. For example, Congress chose to limit the scope of investor suits in federal court over 20 years ago. And the Delaware courts have also put in place limitations on shareholder litigation that companies and shareholders can make use of today. And here's the key thing that I want you all to think about. Nobody in this room should be in favor of creating any doubt whatsoever that fraud doesn't pay. Allowing that to happen favors the competitor you have, who skirts the line a little too carefully. And I know that everyone in this room who's committed to creating sustainable, long-term public good is not in that group. Any change like this in the past has always occurred after careful public analysis of the arguments on both sides. It took the views of millions of investors on one side and managers and strategists on the other. This has never been the way we've done this in America. It's never been the product of a one-sided process that one company could initiate with the staff of my agency. We should all agree, as we always have, that investors deserve better than that. So, how do we move forward from here? For starters, we need rigorous answers to the many legal questions that these rumors have been raising. What would the effect of SEC action be in this area for state law? What would the Delaware courts say about the relationship between forced arbitration and a board's fiduciary duties, for example? Would our approval at the SEC of such a provision even be consistent with the federal securities laws? And what would the practical effect be for the SEC's enforcement priorities, especially at a time when regulators are being asked to do more with less? If investors are barred from bringing suits in court, then the burden of investigating and litigating all these cases might fall entirely on the SEC. How much would Congress need to appropriate to make sure we have enough resources to do that job? And by the way, given the sheer scale of private enforcement of our securities laws, I'm skeptical the government could ever fully prevent corporate wrongdoing on its own. So to really evaluate an idea like this one, we have to know, what would it cost our markets and the investors who rely on them to face more corporate fraud? These are just a handful of the issues that I think we'll need to confront. I'm sure that many of you in this room could point to many more, and I fully expect we're going to hear a wide range of views on the topic. And that's why we need considered public input to make sure we fully understand the cost of ideas like these. A model that we at the SEC would do well to follow, I think, is the detailed empirical work that supported the CFPB's arbitration analysis. Surely public investors deserve a similar level of deliberation if what we're thinking about doing is taking away a fundamental mechanism for how we fight corporate fraud in this country. Now look, before I joined at the SEC, my research and teaching, the things I focused on, were really what we're here to talk about today. How we give managers and shareholders incentives to build the kind of sustainable value that makes American markets the envy of the world. And what I've learned in my first few weeks on the job is that the most important thing we can do to create long-term sustainable value in this country is to make sure that corporate crime doesn't pay. Look, there are always going to be short-run scam artists who seek to steal rather than create long-term value. As my uncle, my cousin, and first responders everywhere know, it's also an unfortunate truth that as hard as we try, we'll never be able to prevent every fraud or catch every crook. That's why I'm skeptical about handcuffing investors who play such an important role in detecting fraud. But whatever path we choose, we should choose it in broad daylight, and we should choose it with the help of all of you. I'm deeply grateful for the chance to be here today to talk with you all in these important conversations about the long-term future of our companies and our markets, and I so look forward to the rest of our day together. Thank you very much.